I remind you of the frequent phenomenon whereby the working capital that produces a definite return in a newly developed area of acquisition has later to be expanded considerably in order to continue to yield the same return. We might also point to the effect of medication which, in the beginning, can be increased by a small increment of the doses, whereas later exactly the same additional applications produce much reduced effects, or we may point to the joy brought about under strained financial circumstances by a profit which, however, will no longer produce a joyous reaction if it is continuously repeated. The most common example refers to the so-called threshold of consciousness. External stimuli that affect our nerves are unnoticeable below a certain strength, but when this threshold is reached the stimuli suddenly evoke sensations, and the stimuli's merely quantitative increase brings about an effect of qualitative determinateness. In some cases, however, the increase has an upper limit with regard to this effect, so that the simple continuation of an increase in the stimulus beyond this threshold results in the disappearance of the sensation. This points to the most extreme form of discrepancy between cause and effect which is brought about by the mere quantitative increase of the cause, namely, the direct transformation of the effect into its opposite. With reference to the example of medication, it should be specifically mentioned that homeopathic experiments have demonstrated a direct contrast in the effects that a purely quantitative change in the doses can bring about in one and the same patient. With reference to electric shock treatment, it has been observed that frequent repetition may turn the result into its opposite and again into the opposite of the opposite. It is an everyday experience of major and typical importance that almost all pleasure-affording stimuli can, after an original increase in pleasurable sensation, lead to its arrest and even to positive pain. Finally, the incommensurability of objective causal stimuli and the subjective sensation evoked is also illustrated in the following way. Very low economic values, which are values nonetheless, often do not incite us to behavior that would otherwise correspond to economic values as such. There are objects of money value, such as stamps, whose money value is not at all taken into account and does not operate as a factor in dealing with these objects. We expect replies to inquiries from far-off people of whom we would or could not demand a penny, and who themselves have no interest in the issue. If the recipient of the letter is of equal social status, we would not dare to enclose a stamp for the reply. Someone who is thrifty with pennies in other matters is usually less concerned about thriftiness with regard to stamps or bus fares. It would appear that a threshold of economic awareness exists that varies according to the wealth and temperament of the subject, so that economic appeals below that level are not experienced as economic ones. This is probably a phenomenon common to all higher spheres. For such spheres emerge when already existing and perceptible elements converge towards a new form and are thereby elevated to a new and, as yet, unknown importance. In this way, things become objects of law, of aesthetic enjoyment and of philosophical interest, things whose well-known content attains a new aspect. In order that this may occur, a definite quantity of such elements is also presupposed in many cases, and if they remain below this quantity, then they do not enter that higher, more difficult to excite stratum of consciousness in which these categories live. For instance, certain colors or combinations of colors may be visible in all their clarity, and yet they do not incite an aesthetic pleasure if the space which they cover does not have considerable dimensions. Prior to that, they are simple entities which certainly overstep the threshold of sensory awareness but not that of aesthetic awareness. There is also a threshold of historical awareness which creates the remarkable disproportion between personal energies and their historical consequences. There have been many Indian ascetics who taught a similar doctrine to Gautama, but only he became Buddha. There were certainly many Jewish teachers whose sermons did not differ much from those of Jesus, but only he has influenced world history. This phenomenon can be seen everywhere. The importance of personalities forms a continuous scale, but there is a point above which the historical significance of a personality commences, whereas those who remain below this threshold of significance have not merely a lesser effect but none at all, and they sink into oblivion. At a higher level, perhaps, lies the threshold of philosophical consciousness. The same phenomena that in minute quantity belong to the transitory irrelevancies of everyday life, and which, perhaps in somewhat greater quantity, provoke aesthetic interest, can become subjects of philosophical and religious reflection if they emerge in powerful and exciting dimensions. In a similar way, there exists a quantitative threshold regarding the sentiments of tragedy. All kinds of contradictions, futilities and disappointments that are negligible as single events of daily life, or that even have a humorous trait, take on a tragic and deeply disquieting quality when we become aware of their tremendous diffusion, the unavoidability of their repetition and their coloring not only of a single day but of life in general. In the legal sphere, the threshold is marked by the principle, minima non curat praeter. The theft of a pen is quantitatively too insignificant even though qualitatively and logically it constitutes a theft to set the complicated psychological mechanism of legal consciousness into motion. This too has a threshold, and stimuli that remain below this threshold, although they may stimulate other areas of consciousness, cannot arouse a psychic legal reaction, let alone a reaction by the state. The threshold of economic awareness. The fact that economic awareness is also equipped with a specific threshold explains the general inclination to prefer a continuous series of small expenses that each pass unnoticed to a single, once and for all larger one. When Pufendorf suggested to the prince that it would be preferable to impose a modest tax on many objects rather than a high tax on a single object, on the grounds that people do not like to part with money, fort der à la dessert, he did not mention the crucial point of this argument. Even though the people have to hand over their money in one form or the other, only in one form does handing over the money remain below the threshold of economic consciousness, and the single sum of money that is handed over is not elevated into the category of economy calculation, sensation, and reaction, just as two weights, each of them below the threshold of awareness of pressure, do not produce any sensation when placed on the hand one after the other, but do produce one if placed on the hand at the same time. This may be interpreted as a passive resistance on the part of our simple or complicated sensations, which first has to be overcome in order to transfer the influence to our consciousness. This resistance can, however, be an active one. One can imagine that our receptive physical psychic organs are, at any moment, in a state of agitation so that the effect of a new stimulus depends on the relation between the direction and strength of the new and the preceding inner movement. The effect can be in the same direction, spreading without restraint, or it can be in the opposite direction, becoming totally or partly counterbalanced so that the receptive organ can move in the proper direction only after overcoming a definite resistance. This kind of conduct also encounters what we term differential sensitivity.